Hi everybody, welcome to Module 5. We will be getting into population geography. This is the first section where we kind of make the transition from some of the more physical geography-oriented material, where we talked about geology and climate and all that sort of stuff. And we start now talking about things that are more what we usually refer to as the social sciences, where we talk about humans and human interaction. Population is a good transition between the two because it's partially about humans as social beings and the way we relate to each other, and then in terms of the geography, how we relate to each other across space, right? In terms of the international ways in which we organize our economies and our global society. But there's also an aspect in here about just how humans are animals. When we talk about population, we're talking about reproduction and we're talking about resource consumption. So in that respect, it's also a little bit kind of thinking about humans as living beings as well as social beings. Okay, so the four main points we're going to hit in this video is first, why it's important to study population. We'll then talk about some basic terminology. We'll get into discussion of migration, and then we'll talk about three major perspectives on population, and we'll do it in a way that's a little bit more involved than they get to in the book. So both, I think, main points number 1 and number 4 kind of diverge from the book a little bit here, so it's important to make sure you're watching this video. Okay. So main point number 1, why is it important to understand the geography of population? Well, because a lot of the other things we'll talk about later in this semester really depend on it. You know, when we talk about things like, when we start looking at the, things like politics and language and things around society, it's important to understand where the people are, which helps explain why things happen kind of the way they do. So here's a general definition. Population geography is the study of the spatial and ecological aspects of population, including some of these key terms here that I'm going to kind of get into more specifically. In terms of density, how dense is the population, what is the fertility rate in terms of how many babies are people having, issues around gender, health, age, mortality, as well as migration. When we talk about the population of a particular country, like say the United States, it changes not just based on who's born and who dies, but also who leaves and who comes into the country, immigration, right? So one of the things that makes this kind of critical to study is also if, there's an issue here environmentally that if the population of the world gets too big, of course, there could be serious repercussions for human societies, but also the general environment. One scholar estimates that if Western lifestyles, like the kinds that we live here in the United States, are adopted by a significant number of Earth's 7 billion inhabitants, we may soon deplete or contaminate most of Earth's life support systems. And so we'll talk a little bit about this potential impending doom. All right. So when we talk about the geography of population, it's important to note that, of course, population is not evenly distributed around the whole world. Most people probably don't know this particular fact, but that there are actually more people living inside this circled area than there are people living outside it. Places like China and India, Southeast Asia, Japan, Indonesia, there's actually more than half of the world's population is concentrated right here. There are some other big concentrations, of course. The eastern United States is one, but also Europe is another big concentration. And then there's some places in the planet that are basically empty, like the Sahara, or Australia is relatively empty, or the Amazon basin, and of course Antarctica. And so there's this unevenness to where people are at. And it's important to understand population for a couple reasons. And, we'll talk a lot about people as consumers of resources, but people are also the producers of things. We're the producers of economies. We are the producers of politics. We are the producers of culture. And so where we are and how many of us there are also has that impact. And so one of the reasons, again, why population is important goes back to this concept of a political philosophy of a scholar named Michel Foucault. He's dead now. He died in the 80s, but he was a French philosopher, and he talked a lot about what he calls biopower and biopolitics. And so the rationale kind of goes like this. So it takes a couple points to kind of follow the logic here, but this is about why population is so much of concern to modern governments and the way in which people try to run the planet and economies and politics. He argues that there was a big shift that occurs back in European history around what's called the Treaty of Westphalia. And there's a big shift here in terms of what power is about. Okay, so this is what Europe sort of looked like around the time period of the Treaty of Westphalia. This is 1648, so it gives you an idea about how long ago this is. Prior to this treaty, and we'll get into this too when we talk about political geography in a few weeks, but prior to this treaty, countries, there wasn't really countries the way we think about it today. There was different empires, there were different ruling families that tried to control different areas, but there wasn't what we take for granted today in terms of countries. So think of this, if you're into some videos like Game of Thrones, it's sort of Game of Thrones, right? You've got all these competing families that all claim to be the ruler of everywhere, and they're fighting with each other, and they may hold different territories, but they basically are all making claims that they're the rulers of everything, and they're kind of fighting it out. After the Treaty of Westphalia, this changes. After the Treaty of Westphalia, countries get to make this agreement that they are not going to interfere with the internal affairs of what the other countries are doing. So in other words, France is going to have a government, and they're just going to govern France. They're going to let Germany govern what Germany does. They're going to let the Spanish govern Spain. They're going to let the English govern England, etc. This is a big change, like again, something we take for granted today. But when you do this, the people in those countries become, like if you're the King of England, what is going to make you more powerful than the King of France or the King of Spain or these other countries is going to be how productive your population is, right? Because your people are your soldiers. They're also the people that are making things in the factories. They're the people that are the farmers. And so now competition isn't just about conquest and trying to take over other realms. It's about trying to become the most powerful country compared to other people. And the best way you can do this is to try to make your population productive. And so, as it says here, power, the government power used to be about protecting the king or the queen from like the population, right? Keeping them in power, keeping down revolts, all that. Now all of a sudden it's not just about keeping down your population or taxing them, it's like how productive can you make them. This is how you compete with your rivals, right? Is by having a more productive population. So you capture the productivity of living people. And so there's this idea that the economy, right, in terms of being able to run things efficiently, is this new, quote, truth. And that governments have to govern according to this economy. They have to try and make their economies as effective as possible. So one of the things they do, and this is to make people productive, they start instituting all sorts of things that they didn't used to do, right? They have things like public health campaigns, because a healthy population is a productive population. They also do disciplining, and in terms of like schools and the churches and the government, try to not just, if you want productive people, you don't just want them healthy, you want them working, you want them healthy and working, but not for themselves, you want them working for you. So part of it's also about this discipline and making them do things for you. You also don't want a whole lot of crime, right? Because that's inefficient, it hurts productivity, it also hurts the way the government can kind of capture that productivity. And with this, you also then get the beginning of a lot of what's called statistics. Sorry, this gets covered by my picture here, but statistics is the next point here. Governments become very, very interested in how many people are being born, how many people are dying. They start doing running a census to see how many people there are in the realm, where they all are, how wealthy they are, etc. Because the idea is that you're governing a population of people, not to protect the government, but to produce for you. Now, while this sounds kind of nice because they're doing things like education and healthcare and all of this that governments start getting involved with, there is also this dark side here, which I'll do this to make it a little more visible, called necropolitics, which basically just means politics of death. And it's this idea that there are oftentimes in any population potentially some group of people that are hurting productivity, that are threatening the larger body politic. And that's where you get things like, for instance, in Nazism, where people started getting killed and put into concentration camps because they were seen to be some kind of threat to other people in the country. Now, Nazism is the kind of extreme example of this, but all countries do this to some degree, including liberal democracies such as the United States, where, think of like how there are some groups of people that the government can sort of kill because they're saying they're protecting the rest of the population. People like drug dealers, people like murderers, terrorists, etc. And so there are always these kinds of people that the government, while they're trying to protect and nurture life and make it productive, is also usually involved in killing some people for different reasons. And so that's kind of the nasty flip side of this kind of way of making your population productive. So you shouldn't think of it as being all, happy kind of processes. Okay. So why is it important to study population? Well, for the reason of understanding environmental impacts, but also economy, politics, culture, warfare, income inequality, all these things tie to population, and I'll get into why. Okay. Now, main point number 2, some important terms. I'm going to breeze through these kind of quickly because they're in the book and they're also just in the PowerPoint. You can read the definitions, but I may just make a couple of quick points about this. So population density is important. This is, instead of just measuring how many people there are, sometimes you get a lot more information by seeing how many people are there per unit area, like per square mile. Think of the difference between Manhattan Island and Keene, right, in terms of population density. There are so many more people per square mile in Manhattan, it makes it a very different place than you might see in another area. And people are very unevenly distributed, creating huge disparities in density. You get places like the Yukon Territory in Canada where there's almost nobody per square mile, and again, versus some of the major cities. And as I showed in that one thing, 19% of all humans reside in China. This is blocked, sorry, 17% in India. When we talk about the United States and everything going on here in the United States, it's important to realize that it's only 4.4% of the entire world's population is having the American experience, right? Okay, and again, this shows you those main concentrations of population. Here it's showing population density, and so we'll do it per square mile here. You can see some places are 0 to 2 people per square mile, like most of Canada, Australia, Siberia, and then you get the really densely populated areas, like we get some here around Chicago and the East Coast, but the real dense ones are like Europe, India, China. There's another term that connects to population density called carrying capacity, and that's the maximum number of organisms that can be supported in a given area. This is a term that comes from biology and is used for other kinds of species. And it provides a more meaningful index of density, right? Because you can have, like for instance, if we go back a slide here, there's a lot of people in India per square mile. But India is also incredibly productive, and so there is, in terms of the landscape, they can raise a lot of rice and wheat and other kinds of foods, and so it can support to a large extent this very large population density. Whereas the places that don't, like the very high northern latitudes here that are very cold, they couldn't possibly support that kind of population. So you could actually start outstripping your resources with a much smaller population up in these areas than you could in these areas here. So it's not just about how many people per square mile, it's also what kind of environment is it, how productive is it. And so again, taking it from biology, there's this idea that you have, hold on, let me go back a step here, this idea of biotic potential, which is essentially how many offspring could you have over your lifetime. And different species have different biotic potentials. Of course, there are things like, whales or elephants that only have a few offspring over their entire lifetime. And then you have things like spiders, which can make thousands of offspring over their lifetimes. For humans, let's just, in terms of what we are capable of, probably, looking at maybe a woman over her lifetime could have about 15 kids. Sure, there's some people that have had more, most have much less, but that's about our biotic potential. Every species has the ability to produce more of themselves than currently exists in the previous generation. And that makes sense because if you didn't, then your species would have died out a long time ago. But what keeps that population then in check is natural selection, and it relates to this concept of carrying capacity. And so this is using the example of fish. You have 2 fish in a stream, then they make 4 fish, and then they make 6 fish, and right, it kind of expands, and it will keep doing that. These fish have the biotic potential to just increase their population exponentially, but there are things that are going to keep that population down. You're not going to have enough oxygen in the water. There's not going to be enough food around. Diseases, predators, just not enough space. And so because of that, you arrive at what's called carrying capacity, which is how many individuals that stream, in this case fish, can take. Sometimes the carrying capacity of one place can be expanded by drawing on the resources of another place, right? So this is very critical when we think about humans as a species. In this question, are humans subject to the same pressures as other species? And in many ways, we are not, right? So, hold on, I've got to make this small again because it cuts off. But, this is a cartoon saying, I know you missed the Wainwrights, Bobby, but they were weak and stupid people, and that's why we have wolves and other large predators, right? This is sort of poking fun at the fact that this is not what usually happens with human populations, right? That we don't have a lot of predators and things like that keeping our population numbers down, and so we aren't as susceptible to carrying capacity in some ways as other species are. The other thing is that we move stuff around. The carrying capacity of Manhattan Island, I mean, think about the island itself. It could not support the millions of people that live on that island. The reason those people can live there is they're taking resources from everywhere else in the world and then bringing them there. And you don't see a lot of other species doing that. Deer in the forest might migrate and go to different places and eat stuff from trees, but you don't see them packing a whole bunch of bushes on their back and then taking them all into a city to feed a big giant population of deer the way humans do. There's an optional video here that's kind of funny talking about the differences between human populations and animal populations in that respect. Lots of profanity. Hope you like it. Okay. A couple other terms that are important to know. This is in terms of patterns of natality. That means birth, right? And so people used to talk about what was called the birth rate or the crude birth rate, which was simply the number of births per 1,000 people. But that can be a little misleading because what if, it can be a little misleading for a number of reasons, but I'll leave it at that. What is much more revealing as a statistic and one used by most people in the population field is this concept of TFR, or total fertility rate. And that's measured as the average number of children born per woman during her reproductive lifetime. And so this gives you a much better indication of what's going on with the population. So, it says here, TFR focuses on the female segment of the population, reveals average family size, and gives an indication of future changes in population structure. So a total fertility rate of 2.1 is needed to produce a stable, zero growth population over time. In other words, whether they're measuring it per woman, if a woman is having 2 children, she's reproducing basically herself and a man. And so if you keep doing that, if each woman produces 2 people, it's just every generation is going to reproduce itself and it'll be exactly steady state. Now comes the question, why is it 2.1 and not 2.0? Well, this is because because some kids are going to die before they are able to reach reproductive age. And so the reason why there has to be 2.1 is to account for the fact that there will be some children that won't make it to 15. Right. But there's this idea that you can achieve zero population growth with this kind of TFR. And there are countries that have TFRs below 2.1 that are actually less than zero population that are declining. Places like Japan, some places in Eastern Europe. But it differs a lot from one part of the world to another. And this is a map showing that. So you can see here under 2.1, under replacement, you actually have a lot of different countries here in Europe, Iran, China, Thailand. Quite a bit here is under 2.1. And so now the US has one under 2.1, but that's only for native-born Americans. You have a lot of people immigrating into the United States, and also people that immigrate in tend to have also higher fertility rates. And so that's why the overall US population is not declining because of immigration. But one thing you can also see here, there are some parts of the world that have huge TFRs, right? A lot of parts of Africa, the total fertility rates are much more than over 6 children being born per woman. So this would be associated with very fast growth. And in the book and in the rest of the PowerPoints, you'll see this, population pyramids. Those are something that kind of tells you what's going to happen to the future of the populations. Okay, so that's natality. Then there's also mortality, which is dying. And this is usually done in terms of the death rates, the number of deaths per 1,000 people. And of course, in the developed world, most people die of age-induced degenerative conditions such as heart disease, cancer, etc. Whereas in other parts of the developing world, contagious diseases such as malaria, HIV/AIDS, diarrheal diseases are the leading cause of death. And this shows the crude death rate. And you can see that it is relatively moderate in places like the United States, etc. And then very high death rates in parts of Africa, and also the former Soviet Union here, Ukraine, Russia, etc., and Afghanistan have high levels of death. Okay, so main point number 3, people move. Migration is another big thing when we're talking about population. It's not just who's born and who dies, it's how people move in and out of that population. So early human groups moved in response to the migration of animals. They were hunters and gatherers, and they would move to where the food was. The agricultural revolution, which we'll talk about more in depth here in following modules, allowed human groups to stop their seasonal migrations. Some groups still migrated in response to environmental collapse and in response to religious or ethnic persecution or for better opportunities. As for people who may be following the kind of stuff in the news, Europe, there's been a lot of issues with Europe and people migrating in from Syria and from Africa and other parts of the Middle East. And this has become this huge issue where a lot of people are dying trying to cross the Mediterranean. But one of the things that's very interesting is that where people move to and where they move from has really shifted over years. Right now, Europe predominantly receives immigrants rather than sending out immigrants. But for many, many, many years, Europe was the place where people were leaving. Latin America used to receive all sorts of immigrants, particularly from Europe. Now, Latin America is a place that sends people, and so this shifts and changes over time. And so if you look at some of the major world migrations since 1500, the biggest one was Europeans leaving Europe to other parts of the world. You also had a lot of people from Africa through slavery, of course, being brought against their will into the New World. But that was also a major migration. More recently, you have migration from Latin America into the U.S., but of course there was also U.S. westward migration, right, during the frontier era, moving this way. A lot of people have left India. China has had a fair amount of out-migration. And then, of course, there's a big migration into Israel of people of Jewish descent or Jewish faith from Europe, and then Russians have kind of moved this way across Siberia. And so these are kind of the major world migrations. One of the things that's not even on here is that one of the biggest migrations in human history is actually occurring now within China, where you have people leaving the rural areas and moving into urban areas, and this is happening by the tens of millions of people right now. So the decision to move. Typically, people don't move unless there's something really pushing them out. And so we talk about push factors and pull factors. When you migrate, there are things that are pushing you, making you leave, like the place that you're in. Like, let's take Syria as an example. People are leaving Syria right now because Syria has been an absolute disaster in terms of its civil war, and so people are fleeing to get rid of that. That's a push factor. A pull factor is what is attracting you to some other place. It could be better jobs, better wages, better health care, better education, these kinds of things. And usually it's a combination of the two. Typically, however, people don't leave unless there's a really big push to do so. And of course, sometimes it's not necessarily chosen. Some people are forced to migrate. And then refugees is a certain class of migrant where those are people fleeing from persecution in their country. And the persecution can either be religious, political, racial, or ethnic. All right, and so just so we can see the whole thing here, these are some of the major migration flows today. These are the populations that are having a lot of migrants move into them. So places like Canada, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and interestingly Afghanistan. I can't explain necessarily why that is. It might be a lot of people returning to Afghanistan after so many decades of conflict. And the places that are losing a lot of population, this map predates the troubles in Syria, so Syria doesn't come off looking as bad as I'm sure it would look now if we had new data. Places like Libya, Mali, Somalia, etc. Ireland, interestingly, Iceland, also places losing large parts of their population. Okay, whoops, jumped ahead to talk about this, but this is the push and pull factors that I was just talking about. All right, on to our last main point. The last main point here is the connection between population, resource use, and starvation. And we're going to talk about three different major social science perspectives on this. So first of all, there's been a lot of concern about the fact that the population of the world has been rapidly expanding. Hold on, I'm going to pour my tea and spill it all over my table. Sorry. Okay. The world's population has really accelerated since 1650, but especially since 1900. The crucial element triggering this explosion has been the steep decline in the death rate, particularly for infants and children in most of the world, and there hasn't been as much of a decline in fertility. So until very recently, the number of people in the world has been increasing geometrically, in other words, doubling in shorter and shorter periods of time. So this is what the world's population has looked like. There was about 5 million people, if you go back 10,000 years ago. We got to 1 million people right around the year zero. Excuse me, 250 million people right around the year zero. And we were cruising along, well, like maybe, you know, around between 250 million and 500 million. And then all of a sudden, it starts to really dramatically increase. And in 1800, we have our first billion people. And then in 1930, 2 billion. 1960, 3 billion, 4 billion, etc. And you can see how much quicker adding the next billion has occurred in these years here, right? Whereas it took us, to get to our first billion, took us tens of thousands of years. To get our next billion took 130 years. And then it only took 30 years. And then it took 15 years. Then it took 12 years. And then 13 years. And then it looks like 11 years on that last one. And so we're adding a billion very, very quickly. All right. So the question is this a problem? Okay. We're going to talk about three perspectives on this. And the first one, by Thomas Malthus, says, yes, this is a problem. And this is what he argued. And this guy is from the Victorian time period in England, so old dude, dead a long time ago. But we'll talk about Neo-Malthusians, which kind of take his theories and move them to the present. But Malthus basically was trying to figure out, why did famine occur in different places? And he argued that the reason people would experience famine, right, like starvation, not enough food, was because of overpopulation. And he basically said this. He said, populations will go like this. They will tend to go up geometrically, right, because of our biotic potential. 2 people make 4 people, who make 8 people, who make 16 people, who make 32 people, who make 64 people, who make 128 people, right? You can see how this gets out of hand very quickly. But he argued, food production only increases arithmetically. In other words, if you made 1 bushel of corn one year, the next year you make 2 bushels of corn, 3 bushels, 4, 5, 6, 7. In other words, the increase in your food supply that you can do through agriculture or whatever cannot keep up with your population increase. And then all of a sudden, boom, you have a whole ton of people. So he says, he goes, well, so this is why famines occur. He says, this is your population growth, and it says, and this is your food production line. The straight line is the food production line. He'd say, okay, your food production is going up and up, so your population increases a bit, but at some point, it's going to get to this point where it hits that line. And when it hits this line, you're going to get famine and war and, you know, starvation, disease, etc. And it's going to drop your population back down under that food production line. And then it will recover and it'll expand again, but inevitably, because it increases faster than food production, it's going to happen again. And so this is just so his argument is that famine and starvation is in some sense a natural occurrence that's just going to keep happening because we can reproduce faster than we can produce food. And so just like fish in the stream, right, you start running into these pressures that just keep your population down. And so one of the things he says is, if you're seeing famine, if you're seeing people starving, he says that going and helping them out with food in the short term is actually not really going to help them, because eventually they're still going to hit this line and they're going to starve. And so he says, when you see famine, what you're seeing is the result of overpopulation. And he says that the only thing that can stop this from happening is what he calls moral restraint. Sorry, it got cut off there, but this is moral restraint. And moral restraint in Victorian England speak basically just means stop having sex. Or, just only have a couple kids, stop having sex, and keep your population numbers down by having less fertility. Okay. Well, Neo-Malthusians still hold to this general idea, but because it's 200 years after Malthus, they say, oh, no, it's okay. It's not about moral restraint and lack of sex, but used family planning is their argument. So that's why I've got Malthus with the pimp hat here, is that he's saying, yes, people can have sex. The Neo-Malthusians say this. It's just that you have to use birth control, that other kinds of methods to keep your population down. Okay. That is one perspective, kind of the Malthusian. Then the second perspective kind of flips this over on and argues a very different thing. And it's called the cornucopian perspective. And one of the people that believed in this cornucopian perspective was Mao Zedong, who was the head of China for a long time. And he had this phrase that says, with every mouth comes two hands. And so his argument was basically this. I just put a hat on him because once I got the clip art for the hat, I just have to keep using it. All right. He had this argument, but then there's other people that do too. And there's a scientist named Esther Bozerup who did some research on this. And essentially what they were questioning is they're questioning this food production line. They're saying, is it really linear? Because when Mao says that every mouth comes with two hands, what he says is every person that's born, yes, they're eating something, but they've got two hands and they're actually going out and making more food. They're doing the agriculture, they're doing the planting, they're doing the harvesting. And so in other words, they say as the population goes up, your food production will go up right with it. And they even say actually every person you add adds more food than you had before. So Esther Bozerup decided to look at the data and see if this was actually true. And sorry, I had to back up here so we could see it past the picture. Esther Bozerup's data is good. It's true. This is a graph that shows, let's focus on the red line, which is just the world. This one has to do with industrialized countries versus non-industrial, but let's focus on the world. What is on this other axis here is calories. Sorry, I got cut off by Mao there a little bit. But this is calories per day. And this is the year. And what she found is that in terms of the numbers of calories of food consumed per day, back in the 1960s, when we only had about 3 billion people on the earth, people were eating under 2,500 calories per day. Nowadays, which is actually around here, this chart goes to 2030, so it estimates, but around today, it's 2015 right here, each person is eating almost 3,000 calories. We've increased almost 500 calories per day per person, even though we've doubled our population. In other words, she's saying Mao was right. With every mouth that was born, two hands came with it, and they did increase the food production to the point where we're not actually running out of food. If anything, or actually, we have much more food than we used to when we had only 3 billion people. So in other words, they really poke a big hole in Malthus's argument. Okay. So there still leaves this question. If that's true, that we have more food today than we had when we only had 3 billion people, why are people still starving to death? Why is there still famine? And this is then now the third perspective on population, and it's the neo-Marxist perspective. So that's why I got to put the hat on Marx. All right. What basically Marx's idea is that he said that when you see famine, he believes that there is enough food. He agrees with Mao, and he agrees with, Marx was born and died long before either Mao or Esther Bozerup. But basically, he does take the position that there is enough food in the world. He says the problem is it's not being divided up fairly or with any equality. So Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels blamed poverty and starvation essentially on the evils of capitalist society. And so he says, are starvation, warfare, and disease more the result of maldistribution of the world's wealth than of overpopulation? Well, that's what they argue. So they're saying that if you see a famine, there's plenty of food in the world, and the data does back this up. There are some really disturbing statistics out there, like North Americans actually throw away more food every year than sub-Saharan Africa eats. And so, yes, there's definitely, evidence that the food is not being distributed evenly. And so he says, okay, if there's a famine, the problem's not too many people. The problem is political and economic. We don't have enough equality in the world. And so the people that are really suffer from starvation, it's not because there's not enough food, it's because they don't have access to it because of economic and political reasons. And then, therefore, the solution is not keep the population down. The solution is distribute the food more evenly. All right. So then the question comes, so who's right in this particular scenario? Well, they all have some very good points. I think the Neo-Marxists are very correct, and then they say that when people are starving, that it probably isn't the result of there not being enough food. It's usually the result of inequality. The cornucopians are correct that if you look at the data, the more people you have, the more food you actually produce. But Malthus seems like he still has a point, which is that there must be some point out there in which we have too many people and can't support them. Yes, we're supporting 7 billion people right now. Can we support 8 billion? Can we support 15 billion? Can we support 100 billion? It seems like at some point we run out of something, right? It just can't keep going on forever. Well, this is where one more important term comes into play. And the term is a little bit of a handful. It's the global human appropriation of net primary productivity, which has the very snappy acronym HANPP, which, pretty crappy acronym. But this is what it means. This is the percentage of all the photosynthesis happening in the earth. How much of that photosynthesis is going right here into our mouths in terms of feeding the human population? And it used to be much, much less than 1% of all the photosynthesis going on went to humans. Now it is estimated that anywhere between 20 and 40% of all photosynthesis going on land is going right here. And so this would seem to be where we start running into Malthus's upper limits. It doesn't matter how many hands we have out there producing food, at some point, can we actually have an ecological system that's functional if we have, let's say we get up to the point, say we double our population again, and we have 80% of terrestrial production all just going to people. Is that sustainable? Is that something where the ecological webs of relationships really kind of disintegrates? What happens at that point? And so this seems to be the kind of, there is an absolute, kind of limit out there. It's just that we haven't necessarily reached it yet. Although, with some of the environmental and ecological problems that are coming up, maybe we have, and we just haven't seen all the negative consequences yet. And this is just terrestrial production. It doesn't include the productivity of the oceans. Of course, we are taking a pretty big chunk of the energy from the oceans in the form of fish. And overfishing, which has become a bigger problem, but our percentage is actually lower in the oceans. But still, it does show that out there somewhere, Malthus is probably going to be right in the long term if we keep adding billions and billions of people to our population. And so another important concept that connects to all of this is what's called the human footprint concept. And that's the idea that when we talk about population, not every person, not every one of those 7 billion is equal in terms of the amount of resources they use. And often what we use and consume, we don't even see the consequences of that. Right now I'm drinking some green tea. I'm sure it wasn't grown in New Hampshire. The breakfast that I had this morning, the cereal came probably from the Midwest somewhere, etc. So the impact I'm having is really kind of spread out. I don't really see it. And so, but one thing we do know is that people that live a more affluent lifestyle like we do here in the United States use far more resources than people in less developed countries. So for instance, if we add 10 more people to the planet that are in India, the amount of resources they're going to use over their lifetimes is, let's say, this. If we add 10 more Americans, well, they are going to be using a lot more resources over that time period than the 10 Indians, right? So like, for instance, I have a daughter who's 12, and the amount of resources she's going to use over her entire lifetime is much bigger than a child who is 12 right now in India is going to use over their lifetime, more than likely. And so not all people are kind of the same there. And then I'm not going to get too much into this. We'll talk about this more when we get into some stuff on agriculture. But another thing that also massively impacts is meat eating. Meat eating is terribly inefficient in terms of the use of grain because it takes, whereas you could take 100 kilograms of grain and turn it into essentially 10 kilograms of people, if you turn it into cow first and then we eat the cow, you actually lose about 90% of your energy on each stage as you go up the food chain. But we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. All right, so it's been kind of a long lecture here, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. That's the end of the key points. Make sure that you do read the chapter carefully and look at the rest of the PowerPoint and other video links like the one about the population in India. You only have to watch the first 21 minutes of that, and then it kind of deteriorates a little bit and start talking Hindi, which probably loses most of us. But that's it for this section, and I look forward to seeing your discussion questions, and I will talk to you at the next module.